Hello, and welcome to the final plenary session of the 2022 AAAS annual meeting. I'm Susan Amara, president of the AAAS and the chair of this year's meeting. As we conclude our virtual time together, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank several important groups of people who work to make this annual meeting possible. First, to my colleagues on the annual meeting program committee who work so hard throughout the year to put together a timely, engaging, and fascinating scientific program. And it really made the meeting come alive. If you liked a scientific session, topical lecture, or workshop, you have this group to really thank. It was a pleasure working with them for the past 2 years. I would also like to thank the dedicated group of reviewers for scientific sessions and our student e-poster competition judges. These scientists, engineers, policymakers, and communicators generously donate their time and expertise in further refining the scientific program that you experienced this week. And of course, nothing would have been possible without our amazing AAAS annual meeting staff. A final thanks also to our major sponsors, whose generous financial support made this meeting possible: Johnson & Johnson, Arizona State University, Drexel University, Quad Fellowships by Schmidt Futures, Shinsu University, and Baden-Württemberg. Spotlight videos and recordings of all the live sessions will continue to be available for viewing on the virtual platform through March 31st, so you can catch up on things you may have missed. Most sessions from yesterday and today will be available within 48 hours. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's last session. Holden Thorp is the editor-in-chief of Science and the Science family of journals. Science has the largest paid circulation of any peer-reviewed general science journal in the world. A chemist by training, Holden is the 21st editor-in-chief since the first issue of the journal, which was published in 1880. Prior to joining AAAS and Science in October of 2019, Holden served beginning in 2013 as provost of Washington University, and where he actually still retains an appointment as the Rita Levi-Montalcini Distinguished University Professor in the Departments of Chemistry and Medicine. Prior to WashU, he spent 3 decades at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which culminated in his service as the university's 10th chancellor from 2008 to 2013. A North Carolina native, Thorp earned a bachelor's degree in chemistry with highest honors from UNC, a doctorate in chemistry at Caltech, and he completed his postdoctoral training at Yale before joining the UNC faculty. Thorp holds an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from North Carolina Wesleyan College and is a fellow of the AAAS and the National Academy of Inventors, and was elected last year to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Holden Thorp.
Thank you, Susan, very much. And thanks so much for all of your leadership for the AAAS and the terrific talk you gave the other night. My wife was listening, and so she was laughing very hard when you said I was the understated editor-in-chief. So thank you for working that in, and also a tribute to Rita Levi-Montalcini, who I have the distinguished privilege of holding the professorship that's in her name at WashU. I get the happy honor here of, before we get to the panel, introducing or listing the winners of the AAAS student e-poster competition. And so congratulations to all these folks. The AAAS student e-poster competition recognizes the individual efforts of students who are actively working toward an undergraduate, graduate, or doctoral level degree. We would like to thank Quad Fellowships by Schmidt Futures for their support of this year's competition. Students competed in 10 different categories with their own student level, graduate and undergraduate. It is with great pleasure that I now announce the first place winners of the Quad Fellowships by Schmidt Futures 2022 AAAS e-poster competition. In the category of biochemistry and molecular biology, the graduate student first place goes to Reiko Uenoyama from Iwate University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Marissa Arthur from Biola University. In the category of brain and behavior, the graduate student first place goes to Gregory Boyack from the University of Pennsylvania, and the undergraduate first place goes to Olivia Sue from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. In the category of cell biology, the graduate student first place goes to Jocelyn Landazuri Venueza from the University of Washington, and the undergraduate first place goes to Yashvi Shah from Drexel University. In the category of developmental biology, genetics, and immunology, the graduate student first place goes to Shreya Soni from Drexel University. The undergraduate first place goes to Sarah Von Dyke from Arizona State University. In the category of environment and ecology, the graduate student first place goes to Ghazal Shibastanipur from Tufts University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Kelsey O'Brien from Iowa State University. In the category of medicine and public health, the graduate student first place goes to Janelle Edwards, Drexel University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Cameron Zarita from the University of California at Irvine. In the category of physical sciences, the graduate student first place goes to James Malloy from Georgetown University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Emily Salino from Moravian University. In the category of science and society, the graduate student first place goes to Catherine Jordan from Carnegie Mellon University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Samantha Moss from Arizona State University. In the category of social sciences, the graduate student first place goes to Carly Bush from Arizona State University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Sweta Rao from Drexel University. And finally, in the category of technology, engineering, and mathematics, the graduate student first place goes to Sanjaya Sharma from Florida Atlantic University, and the undergraduate first place goes to Jessica Rosendorf from Harvard University. Congratulations to all of these outstanding winners. And now we're going to have the panel that you all came here to hear on science communication. This was motivated over the last really several months, but even longer, as we've dealt with observing a lot of the challenges that have come in science communication from the pandemic and from the rise of social media and from the challenging political environment that we've been in over the last several years. We have assembled a panel of superstars who have been at it in science communication, most of them for certainly much longer than I have, and who will bring their experience to to see if we can find an answer to what we're supposed to be doing to get more people to appreciate the role of science and its ability to impact our lives in a positive way. I'm going to introduce each one of our panelists with a first question for them, and I'm going to begin with Jane Lubchenco. Jane is certainly a familiar face for everyone who's come to this meeting. One of the best talks that I first was introduced to AAAS meetings was her talk in Seattle, which seems so long ago, the last time we were there in person. Jane is a professor at Oregon State University, and she's been in the federal government advocating for awareness and action on climate change and many other things in the environment for multiple presidents. And thankfully for all of us, she is serving now in the Biden administration in the office of an OSTP as a deputy director. Jane, thanks for doing this for us.
Holden, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So you've been trying to get people to appreciate the details of climate change for many years. And you can comment on this, but I would say we haven't had that much success at getting both parties politically to be with us when it comes to climate change. And one of the things that we've been hearing a lot in the pandemic is how science has been politicized. I happen to believe that it's not the fault of scientists that happens. It's more just the nature of politics. There's a very famous story about you and Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina going to see Newt Gingrich to talk to him about climate change that, for me, really crystallizes how challenging this is to get both sides to buy into the science. So tell us that story and kind of how you've seen this evolve and where you think we might be going with that.
Thanks, Holden, and thanks for the invitation to join this conversation today. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to what the other panelists have to offer. I want to start my response with a reflection. I know that we'd hoped to have this year's meeting in Philadelphia, which would have been great for many reasons. One of which was that the last time that AAAS convened in Philly was 24 years ago, in 1998, to celebrate the 150th anniversary of AAAS. Millie Dresselhaus was president, I was past president, and we were treated to Ben Franklin, the actor, talking about his life and legacy, and President Clinton and Millie talking about the importance of science. The month before that meeting, Science magazine had just published my presidential address from the previous year, which is the one you alluded to, calling for a new social contract for science, one in which science was more responsive to societal needs, in addition to scientists' own curiosity, one in which scientists communicated their knowledge widely to inform understanding and decisions, and one in which scientists acted with good judgment, wisdom, and humility. Now, I would say that much has changed in the intervening 24 years. For example, today in environmental sciences, there's a much greater emphasis not only on effective communication of science, but engagement, two-way engagement with society. Secondly, there's been a discernible shift to embrace the importance of use-inspired science along with basic science. And three, an intense focus on crafting solutions to problems, not just diagnosing them. But despite those changes, and the challenges loom large, and we'll be exploring some of those today. Now, the need for many of those changes was obvious in 1998 when I met with Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, along with Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina. I was invited to meet with the speaker in his Atlanta offices and brief him on climate change. And after the three of us summarized the evidence, the speaker said quite emphatically that he believed the science and he agreed that the consequences of climate change warranted action. But then he wanted to know what policies or actions he could champion that were different from that Al Gore thing, whatever it was that Al Gore was pushing. So we discussed the overarching need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but he asked for ideas of how to do that was different from whatever Al Gore was promoting. So the political context in which the scientific information played out came through loudly and clearly. And part of my reflection and analysis of that is simply that the actions that people will take, whether it is the Speaker of the House, another elected representative, anybody, the actions that people will take are going to be affected by multiple considerations: values, beliefs, politics, economics, peer pressure, social dynamics, etc. So science will never dictate outcomes, but It can inform them, but only if it's at the table. And that means being relevant, being understood, being accessible, being salient, and being useful. So as we think about our challenges today, the knowledge that science doesn't dictate outcomes, it should inform them, is relevant. But it's equally relevant to be cognizant of the various factors that affect decisions. And that's why we need to listen more to social scientists and what they have learned in the intervening 25 years about how to communicate effectively, what science, how science is heard, what people value, what they look for in terms of trustworthiness, etc. So I hope those ideas will prompt some additional discussions. I would just conclude by saying that I'm privileged to work for a president who does value science and uses science. And as you know, this administration is focused squarely on tackling the climate change challenge, while also creating good jobs and addressing historic inequities. And so the focus as we talk about climate change and solutions is on outcomes, is on improving people's lives. It's on the tangible outcomes that will come from the things that are being set in motion. And the historic bipartisan infrastructure law is really exciting because it provides the wherewithal to begin implementing a lot of these outcomes. Nonetheless, the politicization of climate science remains a huge challenge, and I think we can talk about that more during the next few minutes.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks again for all you're doing for us in Washington. We sure do appreciate it. And, you know, I wrote a column about some of these things not too long ago that had the title, "It's Not as Easy as It Looks." I think that'll be a theme we hear from everyone, and you just explained why keeping science from being politicized is not as easy as it looks. Now we'll go to kind of a life in science communication, and I want to introduce Katie Mack. Katie is a professor of astronomy at North Carolina State University, and she is also the author of an outstanding book that I hope many of you have read called The End of Everything, which is an extraordinary tour through cosmology. And for those of us who don't know as much about cosmology as we should, it certainly was a big help to me when I was transitioning into this job. Katie has 400,000 followers on Twitter. And those of us who are glued to that know that she's also a pilot. So she's an outstanding researcher and she's an outstanding science communicator. And Katie, you hear all the time people say, well, I want every researcher to be a outstanding science communicator. Well, you're someone who is an outstanding researcher and an outstanding science communicator. And can you tell us about what that's like? And do you think that's something that everybody can do?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really honored to be included on this panel. I do hear a lot of people saying that scientists should all be communicating more and everybody needs to get out there. I don't think that every scientist in the world should be on Twitter or doing public talks or writing books or anything like that. I think that, these are distinct skill sets. What it takes to, be really effective in a lab or in a classroom or, running a supercomputer or whatever it is that you do in your scientific life, those are not necessarily going to be the same skills that you can bring to talking about your work to the public. So I think that it's wrong to expect every scientist to do it, but I also think that when a scientist is effective at communication, if they do build that skill, if the scientist is somebody who's passionate about that, who has had the training or has developed their skills or has a special way of connecting with people, I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. There's a whole industry of professional science communicators who are doing amazing work and should be used more in all of the different ways by people within science, people in policy, and so on. There's a huge role for that. And within the scientific community, there's also a role for people who are actually doing the science day to day to bring themselves out to the world and connect to the public more directly. And I think that's one of the things that is shown to be very effective when a scientist is presenting their own work and able to say, this is what I did. You know, that can really help people to connect with the science. And it also, you know, gets to one of the things that I think is a real challenge in science communication is this aspect of trust. You know, when people think that science is done by giant faceless organizations where somebody's just, you know, saying this is how it works, and everybody's like, okay, this is how it works, and you know, when people don't have an idea of how the science is actually developed, or don't know what the scientists are actually doing, how they feel about it, that can be really damaging to people's acceptance of that science. And when people don't know scientists, when people have never met a scientist, don't have an idea, you know, don't have a connection with the scientists, have never followed one on Twitter or, you know, heard one give a public talk, it's a lot easier for them to say, oh, they're just motivated by, you know, money, or, you know, getting grants, or, you know, advancing in academia. And, you know, it's a lot easier for people to write off the results of science as being motivated by something other than what scientists are usually motivated by, which is discovery and, you know, solving problems and following curiosity. So I think that it is really valuable for scientists to be out there, to be presenting themselves as whole people who are doing science, and to show what it is like to be in a research community, to be in academia, what it's like to, you know, trudge through grad school and really be just, you know, focused on one thing and making sacrifices in your life in order to, you know, solve a problem because you really care about getting the answer. You know, I think that's a valuable thing for people to see. And I think that right now, the way that academia is structured, it's very, very hard for a scientist to do that, to really be out there and to really do a lot of connection with the public without making it harder to advance within academia. So there needs to be a much better system within academia to reward the efforts of people who do have that passion, who do have that skill, who are able to engage directly with the public, because that'll allow more people to do it. It'll allow there to be more and more diverse voices of scientists out there in the world, more representation of different kind of people, different kind of science out there in the world. And I think that everybody wins when that happens. And I think that we need to really make changes within the structures of, you know, research science, academia, to make it at least not harmful to your career to spend a lot of time doing that. You know, it should be something that can help advance your career within the scientific community in which you're working, so that it's not a choice between, do I continue doing the science I love, or do I go entirely into the communication I love? Can I combine these things together? I think that's something that should be an option for active research scientists.
Fantastic, and amen to all that, and lots of things to come back to. Thank you, Katie. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Joelle Simpson. She is the head of emergency medicine at the Children's National Hospital, a place that is very, very precious and important to those of us who live in DC, for all that all of you do for our city. Joelle, thank you so much. You're on the front lines of talking to people about the pandemic especially, but lots of other things in medicine. And you're also talking to a lot of folks who haven't necessarily been treated fairly by science and medicine over the last decades. How do you take all of the noise out there that we're all generating, arguing with each other about things, and maybe not being so great at shaping our messages, and translate that in the clinic when you're trying to counsel folks about how to protect themselves from COVID or from anything else? And what does it mean to work one-on-one or in small groups with people rather than 400,000 people at a time like Katie does?
No, that's a great question. There's so many aspects to it that I do want to tackle. You know, we're fortunate in DC to be sort of an international city of sorts, so the diversity that comes to our emergency department is probably unparalleled. And for, you know, the physicians and nurses and medical team that work in my division in particular, you know, we aim for a goal where we can engage our patients in a way that they can participate in the decision-making process for their care. And so when you have an experience like the pandemic, where there is mountains of information and science coming out, and not just science, but other information that people are taking to inform their healthcare decisions, and you need to distill that in a crisis moment, which is usually the visit to an emergency department for most families. And you really have to, you know, our patients expect that the information we provide them to make their decisions is not only understandable, but that it's reliable and relatable to all the aspects that inform their care. And that's me. And by that, I mean that you think about the cultural context with which they're presenting to the healthcare system. You think about all of the social determinants of health that we talk about all, you know, along in our discoveries now. And you think about also the hard science that is there, everything from the actual virus particle and how we, the science of the vaccine protecting you. And so how we meet that in our clinical environment, I think is also important and something to what Katie's speaking of, just as the scientists, and we consider ourselves scientists as well in the clinical realm, but just as it's important to do good clinical medicine and understand the medical protocols, it is also important for us to have specific science around communication in order to meet each patient where they are, and in order to affect that participatory goal that we're looking for in order for safe and quality healthcare. And I think we all deliver that in different ways. I've spoken to you in the past about how presenting myself, not just as the chief of the emergency department, not just as a female physician, maybe potentially also bringing the fact that I am a Black female physician, or that I come from a community that is in DC, even relating all of those aspects to communicating what I believe my patient is listening to and is relating to in order to inform their decision is important. And so we're doing a lot more in our clinical realm and clinical teaching to help our physicians and our nurses and our clinical team to be able to not just master the communication of what our scientists are delivering from research, but then how to relate that to our patients in a way that can allow for that participatory conversation for decision making. And that's the goal. We're still working on best practice around that, but that is definitely the goal.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Plenty to talk about there as well. Finally, we have Kathleen Hall Jamison. Kathleen is a professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. I quote her a lot, always refer to her as the dean of science communication. She's written some outstanding pieces about the pandemic in Scientific American and in Nature Human Behavior and many other places. Kathleen, you've been observing all of this, and you've said some pretty interesting things about how we should have framed some of our terminology about the pandemic, and maybe as it relates to what Katie was just saying, how we could do a better job of helping people understand the process of science and what that means for what we know and what we don't know. So tell us a little bit about what you've been observing the last couple of years.
Well, first, I think the frame on all of this ought to be that science communication did a good job. Could have done better, but did a good job. Unprecedented uptake in vaccination. One never would have expected this amount of uptake this quickly of a new vaccine. That suggests successful communication. When we look at the misinformation and knowledge about vaccination across time, we see on virtually every indicator we have, and we have over 40, that the public has learned more across time. It's getting more right. So while this information is a problem, there also have been real successes, and the amount of informational accuracy is relatively high, much higher than you would have expected with a brand new topic. And finally, confidence in science and scientists remains high. Confidence in Dr. Fauci remains high. This in the presence of very difficult communication challenges over an extended period of time and an unprecedented level of attack on some of these individuals and institutions. So the first frame as we look forward is to remember there have been successes, and then to ask, going forward, how do we learn from what we've done to minimize susceptibility in the future? If we are always fighting a rear guard action against misconceptions that are out there, we're always going to lose. Once something's lodged as a misconception, it's difficult to take it back. But if we can minimize susceptibility to start with, then the likelihood it will lodge and be believed goes down. So I would like to think about minimizing susceptibility and to say, let's stop being so categorical. Let's remember our language to be appropriately nuanced. So when we say masks work, the public hears all masks 100% of the time, when what we mean is high quality masks, properly fitted, well worn, will help minimize transmission and infection. Help is an operative word there. Say that and you minimize the likelihood that people are going to believe about 6 other deceptions that are out there that are predicated on the assumption that scientists said they work categorically, all of them, all the time, when we never meant that. When we say the vaccine is effective, people hear 100% of the time for everyone, and then we get breakthrough infections, and they say, well, what happened to that vaccine is effectiveness statement? What we should have said was it reduces your chances of symptomatic COVID. It reduces your chances of hospitalization. It reduces your chances of death. If we'd said that, we would have expected the breakthrough infections. And particularly if we also say, and remember, viruses mutate. Now we've got the basis of understanding that minimizes susceptibility. Framing, we underuse comparative frames. When we say a vaccine is safe, not 100% of the time, not for everyone, but the public hears that when we say safe. There are going to be some side effects. There are going to be some problems, occasionally, very, very rare problems, but they're going to be problems. We should be saying it's safer than getting the disease. Success for public information science, 3/4 of the American public right now, the adult public, believes that getting the vaccine is safer than getting COVID-19. That's a comparative frame. It's the one we should be speaking through. We also, when we hear have heart problems, very rare heart problems attached to a disease, attached to getting vaccine, we ought to remember as journalists, as scientists, and as fact checkers to ask, well, how likely are they if you get COVID? The comparative frame should always be compared to getting the disease. We also should think about changing some language that is setting us up for deceptive uses of our information. The Vaccine Adverse Reporting System, VAERS, says just by its title that the vaccine is causing these events. We should change that to let people know it's an early warning system. Everything should be reported because we're looking for patterns there that might suggest a problem. There's no confirmed causal inference behind every one of those reports. Most of them don't turn out to be vaccine caused. Let's call it Vaccine Sentinel, or let's call it Vaccine Safety Watch, something that says it's just an early warning system because the scientists are looking to find any problem they might not have detected as a result of their clinical trials, and also to keep track of those that they detected as part of their clinical trials so they can better make sure that we have all the warnings in place to watch out for them so doctors and practitioners will know what to do when they see them. We also should say every time we use VAERS data, we ought to say the event is unconfirmed event, and the data are raw. Unconfirmed event, raw data in the Vaccine Sentinel or Vaccine Safety Watch. And now those people who want to make every one of those events out to be vaccine caused are going to have more trouble doing that. Finally, we ought to remember to tell the public that viruses mutate. And as a result, something that may have been true about Alpha may not be true about Omicron. And as a result, we're talking about different things across different points in time. So bottom line for me, let's frame this as a success. It is, but ask how we can minimize susceptibilities in the future by altering our language to be less categorical, using comparative framing in order to keep people anchored in relationship to the disease, and not creating problems for ourselves by using labels that imply something that just isn't the case.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, thanks all 4 of you. That was a great way to begin. I'm going to go now in reverse order of how we just went with a related question that I've asked Kathleen before. So I'm asking her first because I know what her answer is. But you know, in science, we love our statistics and our orders of magnitude and our exponential notation and all our integrals and derivatives. But is quantitative information really persuasive? I mean, Kathleen, you once gave me an example that I used in a column about how messages about smoking became effective. So I'm going to ask you whether statistics about smoking are what were effective or something else, and then we'll go around to everybody else and see how it maps onto medicine and astrophysics and climate.
You know, the problem with using narrative, and narrative is powerful, is that a narrative can be atypical. And the question is, how do you harness the power of narrative to a typicality inference? So how do we take what we know as typical? We know that you can generalize and then find the narrative, the example that basically makes that real for people, spoken in a voice that's trusted. When we do that, we can link the individual narrative to what we know to be the accurate inference. And then if one can translate those statistics into, say, a communicable sentence that everybody makes sense of, we've also provided reassurance that, yes, we're scientists and we're not using that example illegitimately.
Perfect. Yeah. And Joelle, do you lead with statistics in the clinic, or how do you what do you find most persuasive?
Well, you know, I think and a layer of challenge in the pediatric world is sort of also understanding the relatability of every age group to the statistics and the data that comes out, right? So the context of why my kid at 3 years of age and my kid at 6 years of age and at 16 years of age might all have different data associated to the same disease, like a COVID-19, in terms of being able to have that relatable context of why there might be slight nuances to their care, whether the vaccine is available for one group versus the other and all the other elements. So I think, as Kathleen was saying, that narrative, as I had said before, is really important for it to be relatable. So individuals understand in the clinical context where they stand among that against that statistic and that's hard science that comes out, and why you fill in the blank for why there might be an exception, right? So the 5 and under, why when there's no vaccine, why there might be some slightly different recommendations in terms of protecting themselves. So I think it's all saying the same. I think the two go hand in hand. Statistics and the hard science and the hard numbers are very important, but making those connections in our clinical world is very key in terms of giving people the narrative of what's relevant for them.
Perfect. So Katie, you talk a lot about very, very large numbers and some that are hard for people to imagine. You have a lot of great analogies in your book that help people get their arms around long periods of time and long distances. So tell me how you think about getting more quantitation out there in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use quantitative stuff all that much in the sort of casual science communication I do, because the numbers I'm dealing with are often really, really large, and most people don't really have an idea in their head of what it means if I say that the Milky Way has about 400 billion stars. We can't picture 400 billion. We just can't. Even in my own mind, when I think of a million or a billion, the natural visualization that happens is like, oh, there's a million and then about twice as much, that's a billion. And that's obviously completely wrong, right? and I know that that's completely wrong, but it's not something that really can sink into your brain. And when you work in science in the kind of area that I work in, you end up thinking in terms of sort of logarithms a lot, factors of 10, and you kind of get a system in your mind for dealing with those kinds of numbers, but it still is not really intuitive. So what I try and do in most of my communication is to use visualization, to use analogy, and to try to give people a feel for the physics of what's happening, or the sort of astronomical events, or and in any kind of science communication I do, because sometimes I will talk about other topics that are not my main specialty. That analogy, that metaphor is the most important tool that I use. But the one thing that I will say about that is you have to be very careful when you use a metaphor or an analogy when you're explaining a scientific topic to not allow people to believe that it's 100%, accurate, precise, because a lot of times when an analogy is used, but for, it's a sort of rough approximation to what's actually happening, but it's not, of course, the whole story, people can end up, sort of getting misled and end up in a sort of rabbit hole where they take the analogy as literal, and then they follow that through and end up finding some contradiction, and then everything is a big mess. So I would say that I'm quite careful with those kinds of things, but yeah, I mean, I try and use much more sort of intuitive things than just getting quantitative a lot in the stuff that I do.
Right, great. And Jane, to the public, 1 degree of warming sounds like it's not that much, especially to people who don't know the difference, don't intuit the difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Decades before certain things will happen are hard to conceptualize, and the probability that our various models are going to be realized. What's the answer to all of that as it relates to the environment?
So I think that the 3 panelists that have given just terrific answers are all right and all have elements of a smart way to be doing science communication regardless of the topic. And it's certainly true in communicating about climate change. Just having a whole bunch of facts and barraging people with data is not really very effective. And it's especially not effective when the implications of it are difficult, as you just noted. So having a few select statistics, but coupled with narrative, making that narrative to the extent possible relevant to people's lives, but also using visualization and analogies, metaphors. I think all of those are really, really helpful. We're in the process of working to deliver the next big climate assessment for the United States, the National Climate Assessment that will be due out the end of 2023. And that, I think, is a really nice example. It has been effective, in part because it provides global information about changes that have happened and what we expect, but it also tailors it to specific regions of the country and to different sectors. And this, the next National Climate Assessment, the 5th one, is going to be just sort of so much better than previous ones, in part because we're doing a lot of upfront public engagement. We just completed a series of 32 public engagement workshops, each a day long, on every different chapter of the National Climate Assessment. So we're getting connected with people. The group of scientists that is creating the National Climate Assessment are over 450 scientists from around the country. So really diverse lived experiences, diverse areas of expertise. And all of that, I think, will help make this particular National Climate Assessment reflective of much of what we have learned about science communication. It has to be two-way, it has to be engaging, it has to be not just a bunch of facts, but stories and things that are relevant to people's lives. So I think it's all of the above.
Great. Well, we're starting to get some good questions out of the chat from the audience, and I'm going to go to a few of those. Jane, you get a pass on this one because it's about the administration. But I really want to hear from Kathleen and Joelle, and if Katie, if you have anything to add, that'd be great. So there's a story in the New York Times today that the CDC isn't publishing large portions of the COVID data it collects. Is that a good idea to not complicate things, or is it a bad idea because now nobody knows what's going on? Kathleen, I'll ask you, and then Joelle, and then Katie, if you have anything to add, you can.
Transparency is a norm of science. It makes the culture of critique work, which is the basis of scientific advancement. It enables scientists to engage in self-correction. So making data available for other scientists to work with it to determine what's going on should be something that our federal agencies routinely do.
Yep, Joelle.
I echo that as well. I think about myself as a recipient of that data and processing it to deliver to my patients, allow me to participate in that analysis and that critique as well. And so revealing that data and sharing it with the public, it is, to me, for the betterment of all in terms of being able for us to distill and continuing for science to show that it's willing to be challenged, because, that I think is where we start to build some of that trust, in that we're open to that public discourse, and we're open to sort of, when I talk to my patients and there's gaps in why the study doesn't relate to their particular clinical experience, I appreciate that challenge and go back for our scientists and researchers to fill in those blanks and fill in those gaps. So I think that's a healthy cycle that we should all be living in.
Katie, anything to add?
Just echoing what the others have said, that openness and transparency is fundamental to science working well. So I can imagine that there could be good reasons to curate information that you're putting across, depending on the context. But for the most part, in almost all situations, if there is public health data, then it should be, as long as it's not infringing on someone's privacy, it should be public.
Yeah, great. Well, all this thought.
Non-disclosure also feeds conspiracy theories.
Right.
Because when people ask, well, why can't I have access? All of those assumptions about deviousness and greed and incompetence come to play in the conspiracy theory world to feed distrust of science.
Yeah, and all best thoughts to everyone in the White House press office. They got their hands full. There's a lot going on right now, but this is one in science that they're dealing with today. All right, here's to lighten the mood a little bit. Here's a question. The public is somehow more receptive to comedian commentators when it comes to discussing thorny topics. Might their skills be useful in making science more approachable? When I give talks about this, about the pandemic, I always end with this great thing from The Onion, which I don't know if everybody's seen, but someone will put it on Twitter now that I'm talking about it probably, that says something like, "Nation can't believe they didn't realize how obvious it was to make a lipid nanoparticle with mRNA in it, and that would cure the pandemic." And if you read that, I mean, it's just magnificently done. So let's start with Joelle, but then we can go around to everybody. Joelle, do you use humor in communicating with folks about the choices that they make?
Absolutely. I think, you use all the tools at your disposal to relate to your patient, at least in my experience. And, like I said, I either present myself as the physician, I presented myself as the person living in the neighborhood, or, all the other characteristics at the end of it. And if it also includes humor, but being sure to still respect the science and respect the data and not distill it to a point where it's not recognizable anymore. I think that's really important. And I think it's helpful in this discourse.
Yeah, Katie, you're really good at making it light, even though
you.
you're constantly talking about how the universe is going to end. So how do you do that?
I mean, when you have a topic like that, you have to use humor, or else everybody's just terribly depressed. But I do think that, especially with social media, humor is very important and can very, very directly help get your message out, because when something is funny, people will share it more often. And so the kind of, it's a way of packaging up whatever facts you want to get across in a way that they'll actually spread. So humor is very important. I think a very, very useful tool. And there's not everything should be joked about, of course, but there are a lot of opportunities to use humor, or just kind of playfulness in discussions of science, in ways that can allow people to experience delight in what they're learning, and share that with others. I think that can be a very, very useful tool.
Yeah, Jane, anything to add to that?
I'd say two things. One, anybody who's tried to give a talk in another country has often realized that jokes that work in one culture don't translate well into another culture. So there does need to be some sensitivity to who the audience is, because some humor just doesn't translate. The other thought is that one would not want humor to convey disrespect for a situation. And Katie alluded to this, but I think it's really important because you don't want to be making light of something that is actually really serious for someone. And so being sensitive to that has to be part of the equation.
Yeah. Kathleen, anything to add?
Yeah, when Nicki Minaj tweeted out to her 22+ million followers that her cousin's friend in Trinidad had been vaccinated and gotten swollen testicles as a result. Dr. Fauci was asked about it. He said, I will paraphrase, no plausible biological mechanism. The minister of Trinidad, health minister, said, we looked all over Trinidad. We couldn't find anybody vaccinated who had swollen testicles. The fact checkers said, we've talked to the people who did the clinical trials. They didn't see it as a side effect. There's no evidence from it from the VAERS surveillance. A late night comedian who was male said, more than tens of millions of us have gotten the vaccine and we don't see any evidence of swollen balls. Don't you think we would have noticed if it had happened? The most effective response was the late night comedian.
Right. Yeah.
Being born and raised in Trinidad, I truly, truly admired our minister's response to that. It was awesome.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So here's an interesting one. So someone's raising the fact that there's a lot of science that isn't contested and that gets into the political sphere. I mean, we tend to talk about the pandemic and climate change whenever we get on these topics, but should we be focusing more on science that's not contested in order to help build people's trust up? Katie, this came from something you said, so I'll start with you.
I mean, I think that I think a lot of people's trust in science is very dependent on the context and the specific science, right? I mean, I think that there are, people have a lot of trust in aeronautical engineering and the science behind, how airplanes fly, and they get into airplanes all day, and that's not a problem. But if they're asked to trust scientists about something that has a different kind of impact on their life, something like public health or climate change, where they might have to change the way that they live their life in order to, follow the science in that sense, they're going to look at that a little differently. And so, I think that it's there are opportunities we have to help people to connect with science that does not spark any kind of motivated reasoning, immediate response. And I think that that's great to do, but I don't think it's necessarily something that will impact the areas in which that response is very strong and immediate. So, as I said before, I think more scientists sharing their lives and sharing how they work and more understanding of how the scientific method actually works in practice is very, very helpful. And that might be a place where talking about science that is less contested can be helpful. But I think that a lot of the issues we have around people trusting or accepting or acting upon good science has a lot more to do with the context in which that science exists, the context in which people are applying it to their lives. And that's about values and politics and all of the things that have been discussed about, how, the audience communicator connection is very, very important, and knowing, knowing how to best reach people specifically for the topic and the audience and the context of the social context, that's really, really important.
Kathleen, you have something to add to that?
What we need to continue to remind people in the areas that have polarized about successes that haven't. So, for example, Montreal Protocol, ozone level success. We've got climate science being polarized over here. Let's pull back to say we found ways to work in past under common scientific assumptions, and demonstrably we made things better. Same thing with vaccination. Most vaccinations did not polarize, and we have some risk coming out of polarizing the COVID vaccine that some others now will. But remember, no smallpox, virtually no risk of polio. That's a vaccination.
Joelle,
I was going to piggyback, piggyback on that. In pediatrics, I mean, the science of respiratory illness and vaccines is our bread and butter, and we've been doing it forever. That's the backbone of pediatrics, right? And so COVID raised a lot of discussions that among our families that didn't exist before, when the science of how you transmit virus particles. Oh, well, yeah, now when your kids are turning up to school full of, nasal secretions, and there's no hand washing, and there are protocols in place. Yeah, that's how we've spread illness for years. And now there's more attention to that and scrutiny. And I think that's appealing for areas that we haven't really challenged as much in before. And in my venue, where I talked a lot of school systems and childcare agencies, I think it is nice that we are starting to think about those areas that weren't contested before, vaccine science, respiratory illness management, that sort of, and contagiousness and so forth. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Right. And Jane, Kathleen just raised, two different things in environmental science that are very different when it comes to this. What do you think about all that?
So I think the focus on successes is really important. But she alluded earlier to the fact that public confidence in science and scientists remains high. So I think that is important for us to keep in mind. But I want to go back to something that Katie touched on earlier, and that is the importance of scientists being visible as scientists and engaging and talking about their work. And I'm reminded of a poll that was conducted by Research America a number of years ago that found that the majority of Americans could not name a living scientist. I haven't seen that poll repeated recently, but I think it's quite telling. And it really underscores the importance, I think, of scientists being more visible as scientists, not just as spokespeople, but as working, practicing scientists talking about what they do, as a way of connecting the dots for people between the scientists and the science, and then all the things that we are benefiting from that the other panelists have already talked about.
Yeah, that's really important. I quoted that study once at a meeting that was a third college presidents, a third people from industry, and a third people from organized labor. And I said, okay, the university administrators can't answer. And no one from the CEOs of corporations or leaders of big unions could name a living scientist then. I think, fortunately, I think a lot of people can name Dr. Fauci now, but we need to get a bunch more people out there in that same category.
Holden, if I might, it strikes me that there's another relevant point here, and that is that go ahead. That's a different tangent. Go ahead. Nope.
Well, that's a good way to. I mean, unfortunately, as fun as this is, we're down to 12 minutes. So let me ask everybody. And we'll go in the order we started in, starting with Jane. Who's someone who's not on this call who is an outstanding science communicator that we can emulate?
I would highlight Katharine Hayhoe as a phenomenal science communicator in the climate space. She has made a point of saying that scientists in communicating about climate change have spent too much time sort of barraging people with the facts and trying to connect with people's heads, whereas they need to connect with people's hearts. And so she starts with values, with shared values, things that we have in common, and then builds out from that. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So I would highlight Katharine Hayhoe.
Good, great. Katie?
This is such a hard question because there are so many people out there doing such amazing work in all kinds of areas. I'm going to take an easy way out and shout out a friend of mine, my friend Randall Monroe writes the XKCD comic strip, and it's a comic strip. It's not always about science, but when it is about science, it's really good at distilling something using humor, using something that really gets to the heart of an argument. And he's done some great strips about climate change, about vaccines, things that I think are just very well presented. So I'm gonna use him as an example at the moment.
He's also done a great job of making fun of scientific publishing, which we all thought was hilarious. Okay, Joelle.
I was gonna pull a similar strategy to Katie and talk about a friend of mine, Dr. Lee Beers, who is the recent president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, has really taken the forefront in terms of distilling the science around what's been going on with kids and the relevance, not just to COVID, but even to vaccine science that has been challenged from the past and how it impacts kids. So she's represented us as pediatricians across the country, and I think has done a fantastic job this past year in her presidency.
Yep, great. Kathleen?
The meteorologist Marshall Shepard does a wonderful job digesting complex science through a lens of communication to people, and does it in venues that are really important to reach. His work with the weather community, for example, has helped people who, when they come into an environment which they want to find out whether it's going to rain or not, to also get climate messages.
Great. Okay. Well, we're down to the final round here. Any thoughts on things that we didn't cover, or something you want to lift up from one of the other panelists? And we'll go in the same order we've been going in and start with Jane.
Yeah, so I'd like to highlight some of the social science research that has been going on in the last couple of decades about science communication. And there's just a wealth of it that is out there. We've begun to use some of it, but I think one finding that is worth lifting up is Susan Fisk and her colleague Dupree's study about how important it is for people to not just have confidence that the scientist is competent, but to truly trust them, they also need to see that person as being warm. And that combination of being warm and competent is, in their view, and Kathleen can correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but they are saying that that combination is important for somebody to be trusted. And a lot of what we're talking about here is trust in science. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of scientists who have been sort of focused on the facts and the figures, the numbers, and trying to be almost an automaton in talking about it. And it really, I think, opened up space for people like Katie, who are showing that they are human, that they have a sense of humor, that they have some fun with the science, and telling stories. Doing things that make the science more accessible, more interesting, more relevant, and more credible. And so that focus on warmth and competence, I think, is an important message.
Right. Katie?
Yeah, I just want to echo all of what Jane just said. When I talk to people about science communication, I often bring up some surveys that showed that, yeah, scientists are very trusted, but they're also thought to be sort of amoral and willing to do anything to get their data. And there's historical reasons for those perceptions that are real and very, we really need to wrestle with those as well. So I think that, yeah, presenting ourselves not just as caring about the science, but also as caring about people and caring about life and society. I think those are really, really crucial to building trust. And one thing that we didn't really touch on very much in this discussion, but I think is really key to the question of, is science communication working, however you define working, which is another thing we didn't really get into all that much, is that, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of science communication out there, and a lot of the science communication out there is communicating bad science through disinformation campaigns, through political pressures, through things like that. And some of the bad science is being communicated very well in ways that are very compelling to people. And so I think that if we really want the good science to be out there and accepted and able, in place for people to act upon and to use, we need to have better tools and systems to deal with organized misinformation campaigns, to deal with, unscrupulous vendors of bad science information. And that's a big problem, and it's one that the science community and the science communication community might not be in a place to solve. This is around how media and social media work and the regulations that need to be in place. But we're up against a lot. We're up against a lot of people who use all of the tools we talked about to communicate things that are just not true. And so that's a big challenge that we have.
Great. Joelle?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the 2 points I want to drive home is science and science communicators need to be relatable in the sense that the messenger needs to reflect the communities they're also trying to communicate with. And I keep harping on the point that one of the goals of communication is to allow the recipient of their information to also be able to participate in critique, discussion, engagement of how that science affects their life. And so I think those two things are actually intimately twined. Who the messenger is and how the message is delivered improves the access for those communities so they can engage in a thoughtful discussion about how to distill that information, critique it, and apply it to their own lives.
Yeah, outstanding. Okay, Kathleen, the last word.
Oh, we don't have to be scientists to be science communicators. Everyone should be part of the scientific defense system. So everyone who holds science consistent attitudes should be, when they're talking with their friends and with their family, and they're just moving out around through society, find ways to listen for the misconceptions, find ways to understand where they're coming from, and find ways to increase the likelihood that their personal trust in that relationship can help increase the likelihood that those who are in their spheres of influence act in science consistent ways.
Perfect. Well, I can't thank you all enough for your outstanding thoughts and the great work that you're doing to help build trust in science and make it relatable, and help us chart a path to a more prosperous and equitable future that I know all of you are committed to. And I think given how much enthusiasm there's been in the chat and how many people are signed on right now at 5 o'clock on the Sunday of President's Day weekend, where it's nice weather, quite a number of places, just goes to show how much enthusiasm there is for this topic. And certainly I'll be writing about it a lot more in the future, and I know the 4 of you will be as well. So thank you, Jane, Joelle, Katie, and Kathleen for this outstanding panel. Thanks to everybody at the AAAS who did everything to make it happen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my boss, Susan Amara. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. My thanks to Holden and this distinguished panel. It was such an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. And I think it was a fantastic way to close out this year's annual meeting. While we were all hoping to be together in Philadelphia, we did want to make the virtual space something comparable and at least give the flavor or the feeling that we were still able to gather together. Though much of the content was the same that it would have been in person, we know that a trip to another city for 4 days is so much more than just sitting in scientific sessions and workshops. It's really about the connections, the planned connections, the unplanned connections that lead to collaborations, eureka moments, and lasting friendships. We hope that you experienced at least some of these over the past 4 days. And while sharing a screen can never replace sharing a cup of coffee, we're confident that we'll be back together before long while still maintaining the flexibility and expanded access that the virtual environment really allows. We have one more order of business before closing out tonight's program, and that's the winner of the 2022 AAAS Annual Meeting Platform Challenge. Some of you have been actively engaged in this since Thursday. Others might be wondering what those little lightning bolts were next to your name. But the virtual platform actually keeps track of all your activities, the sessions attended, connections made, exhibits visited, and it rolls it up into an engagement score. And tonight, I have the pleasure of announcing the top 3 attendees on the leaderboard, each of whom will win 2 deluxe registrations to the 2023 annual meeting. Congratulations goes to Julianne McCall, Stephen Prebut, and Elena Castolo. These 3 are the attendees who really made the most of the meeting. For now, keep your eyes on meetings.aaa.org and the hashtag AAASMTG as we begin to reveal more information about the 2023 annual meeting, including the dates, a new city, and the call for proposals. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your engagement. And thank you for helping advance the mission critical work of our community to empower with evidence. We have so much to do to move science forward, and I hope to see you all in person at next year's AAAS meeting. Thanks to all of you.